Okay, hi Bob. Before we start, let me first welcome our audience. Welcome to this new episode of Virtual Talks hosted by the Sharmin Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center of Iran and Persian Gulf Studies. My name is Payman Jafari. I'm a postdoctoral research associate, and my research concentrates on the role of oil in global capitalism. So I'm extremely happy to have with us today Robert Vitalis to talk about his book. He's a professor of political science at the University of Pennsylvania and the former director of its Middle East Center. If you have read one of his earlier books, you will know that Bob is in the business of myth busting for a while now. His first book, When Capitalists Collide, Business Conflict and the End of Empire in Egypt, was published in 1995. In 2006, he published America's Kingdom, Myth-Making on the Saudi Oil Frontier. And his third book, White World Order, Black Power Politics, was published in 2016 and won the International Theory Prize from the University of Sussex. And he's with us today to discuss his latest publication, Oilcraft, which I really enjoyed reading. Oilcraft reads as a successive debunking of extremely influential myths about oil. Influential, I must say, among the left and the right of the political spectrum, as Bob emphasizes in his book. In the book, Bob is actually moving, as it were, through a dense forest, hacking one myth after the other, and with much wit, I must add. So that makes the book very easy, readable, and enjoyable as well. Without further ado, I want to give the word to Bob, who will be talking 30 to 40 minutes, and then we will be back for some conversation with me about his book. So, Bob, go ahead.
Well, thank you, Payman. I'm going to try to get my PowerPoint organized. It says host disabled participant screen sharing. So can you able it?
Yes, that's what I'm going to do. I'm so sorry, Bob.
And you've got that? I just see
Yes.
me. The screen is that you see my screen?
Yes,
Oilcraft?
absolutely.
Perfect. Yep. Perfect. So, Payman, I really appreciate this invite. In fact, you were in the audience at a workshop when I first tried out the concept of Oilcraft in 2014, and I tried out some of these arguments briefly with folks at Princeton in earlier times. Faced some sharp questioning by people like Michael Cook and Larry Rosen. The book, I hope, is the better for it, but we're in trouble now because, as you indicated, the book is out. So for better or worse, what I'm going to invite everyone who's watching this to do then is to take a minute and think about how you understand the role of oil in international relations. Think, what role does oil play, say, in world politics today? And what role do the air and naval bases in the Persian Gulf play in US national security? And more important, think about how you know what you know and where did you learn this? Now, so the book. You might hear that term oilcraft and think it's a variant on statecraft, right? One that recognizes the centrality of oil to national security, US power, and the like, the way so-called specialists in US foreign policy, journalists, and public intellectuals imagine and repeat like a mantra. But of course, I don't mean it that way. Rather, I mean it as an analog to witchcraft. I believe this helps us really understand this infamous photo. Now, European and American men of science once believed in witches. Sir Francis Bacon, for one. He was sure that witches existed, and folks acted on this basis, even though we know they don't, and have a hard time, I think, understanding how people ever did believe in such things. Now, you may also believe that the analogy is outrageous and unfair. Surely our modern, rational, social, scientific, and secular world and its beliefs about oil as special, the lifeblood of civilization and so forth, is a different world altogether. If so, let me try another example with you. Take race. Here's a photo of another book, not by me, The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy, published in 1920. And of course, one that appears very of the moment, in fact, right? Now, the puzzle for Karen and Barbara Fields, seen here in conversation with my colleague Adolf Reed, is how and why the scientifically discredited, utterly false idea that humans are naturally divided into distinct groups, identifiable by certain physical and other traits. How does this persist? Why does it persist? They consider it a kind of magical thinking or imagining that people find impossible to let go of, these two, in fact. Now, racecraft is their term for the rational processes of reasoning that make race appear to the mind and imagination as a vivid truth. The terrain of these false beliefs exists and can be analyzed both on their own terms and, importantly, in terms of the work these ideas do, and that is their effects. The main and insidious one is the continuing legitimation of inequality. So my book argues that what is true about the idea of race and its relationship to the mental terrain of racecraft is true as well about the magical properties that oil, an ordinary commodity, accrues as it transits through oilcraft territory. That is, widespread beliefs about oil as power and the putative need, let alone the ability to secure access or stabilize prices or prevent hostile powers from holding the world economy hostage, have no basis in fact. Evidence for the belief, such as it is, continues to accumulate in the form of US officials, past and present, proclaiming about these things. Here's a declassified document from the 1940s talking about the strategic importance of Middle East oil. And that's the basis of claims that Noam Chomsky has made for decades now about what the US is about in the Middle East, right? And forget documents, starting in 1979, we see the shift in the US military presence from Southeast Asia to the Persian Gulf. Now, the left takes these claims and these alone at face value in comparison, say, to when a government proclaims its commitment to democracy promotion. Why do they do so? Because it seems to confirm their own deep-rooted beliefs in big oil, or as they say now, fossil capital's needs, and about how the US exerts its hegemony over its would-be capitalist rivals. Now, nothing the policymakers armed with these incantations have done can be shown to have made the price of petroleum more stable than other commodities traded on the world market, or to have secured for refiners greater quantities at lower prices, then had the same policymakers refrain from doing all the things they have done in its name, ostensibly, from feting kings in the 1950s to designating the Persian Gulf a vital national interest in 1980, to launching wars without end in 2003. As the fields argue, real actions creates evidence for the imagined thing and constantly dumps factitious evidence for itself in the real world. Now, I know that's a lot to take in, so I'm going to illustrate with an anecdote before going on to discuss the major variants or schools of magical thinking about oil that circulate among environmentalists, generals, self-described energy security experts, all these things believed in and repeated despite what I'm arguing is the implausibility and the lack of supporting evidence. So I'm going to take you back to September 2014. My department sponsored a lunchtime roundtable on developments in Syria and Iraq since the rise of the Islamic State. These are two of my colleagues who rarely agree on anything. Trust me, I've been in that department a long time. But here at this moment, they found a rare common ground. During the question and answer period, when an audience member asked them about the problem that Saudi Arabia's support for jihadists posed for the Obama administration's policy. You remember those days, okay? So one of them, a specialist and frequent UN consultant on power sharing, led off. And he said, the sad, and right, so what about the Saudis? His answer is this: the sad thing about that is fracking is the best means of weakening Saudi influence, which the green side of me doesn't approve of, but I prefer fracking to being dependent on the Saudis. Now, my other colleague, the expert on the Israel-Palestine conflict and member of the Council on Foreign Relations, doubles down on shale, since he said increased oil production at home, he insisted, provided the US new unprecedented leverage over the Saudis. So the point is, it would seem that my two colleagues, and many other people besides them, believe there are costs that something called dependency on Saudi Arabia exacts in the United States. As the cliche from the 1970s imagines it, the Saudis have had Americans over a barrel for some time now. Now, if the audience members in that lunchtime event were like most Americans, or like the undergraduates who take my classes, then their claims would likely have reinforced the widely held but utterly false idea that US refineries get sizable quantities of their crude oil supplies from the kingdom and other Persian Gulf states, or that they ever did, right? It's hard to understand what else dependency could mean, yet the largest share continues to come from the Western Hemisphere, as was the case throughout the 20th century. The actual value of Gulf imports for the past decade ranges somewhere between 7 and 15% of total crude imports. And roughly over that same period, Saudi Arabia, Mexico, and Venezuela, Saudi Arabia and Venezuela were tied or right behind Canada and Mexico for largest suppliers. Okay? Assume my colleagues knew these facts, but had no time to go into detail. It would then appear that in one case, dependency obliges the US administration to tolerate the Saudi government's aiding anti-Assad jihadists in Syria, or bombing Yemeni civilians, and spreading radical Salafist beliefs everywhere, while in the Venezuelan case, the same level of import dependency posed no insurmountable challenge to seeking the overthrow of the country's leader. Let's just say that the bad news for all those who dream of a Saudi oil-free future sooner rather than later, or who imagine that Washington's leverage with Saudi frenemies goes up as the quantity of imports from Tehran go down, is that some elementary features of world oil markets and the refinery industry have to be wished away. And we can talk about this later if you'd like. But let's stop for a second, because you all have an excellent opportunity to learn more about Oilcraft's power over you. By resisting the train of thought, at least some of you are setting off on as a consequence of my questioning the validity of this venerable piece of folk geopolitics. That is, either you already know the empirical problem with the idea of US dependency and have an alternative answer worked out, or else you are beginning to scramble. I have witnessed numerous interlocutors at this point hop from the idea of import dependency to Saudi Arabia's role as price stabilizer, alleged role as price stabilizer, a swing producer, or in some other way attempt to solve for oil in the much believed in, yet utterly factitious idea that the United States has a, quote, deal with Saudi Arabia, one that trades oil for security. And the deal, we are now told, was struck way back on the USS Quincy in February 1945. Every book that writes about US-Saudi relations talks about this deal that was cut, of course, no such thing ever happened on the Quincy, and we can talk about that. Okay, so look, this is tricky, right? This deal, because in virtually any year, or let me put, sorry, the US Persian Gulf Force projection has cost about as much as the entire Cold War has cost, okay? And in virtually any year exceeds the value of all oil exports from the region to the rest of the world. What US taxpayers pay for the elusive good called energy security, in other words, exceeds what US refiners pay for oil imported from the region by an order of magnitude, according to my friend Roger Stern's analysis, right? This is a fancy way of saying that one bill is 10 times or more higher than the other, okay? But advanced thought, as represented over there at the Woodrow Wilson School and other places, in one another school or paradigm in international relations in the United States would suggest that my colleagues approach the question wearing the wrong analytical lenses. That is, the quantity of imports flowing from the kingdom and nearby producers to Eastern Seaboard and Gulf Coast ports explains little about the US strategic posture, according to some. In international relations, in the world of international relations, alternative conceptualizations tend to cluster nearer to one or the other of two rival visions of a more violent, or as they like to say, anarchic world versus a more tameable cooperative system of states. In the one version, the expanded US military presence in the region is really driven by the need to prevent present or future enemies from gaining control of and potentially denying access to the scarce and thus vital oil resources on which the defense of the homeland rests, particularly as it's imagined during wartime. Not so for all those who instead understand the US strategic posture instead as the liberal Leviathan, in the words of John Eikenberry, and as the key factor in the relative stability that makes global oil trade at relatively inexpensive prices possible in the first place, right? So in the second vision, the US is guaranteeing the flow of oil during peacetime, because otherwise it would be under threats of all sorts, okay? Given the myriad potential sources of disruption, again, to the lifeblood of advanced and developing capitalist industrial societies. Then we finally have the comrades of mine on the left who conventionally excise the liberal in the concept hegemony to tell an old and venerable story about the role of oil in the US exercise of imperialist power, right? That is, behind the rhetoric of access, the United States, we're told, is really either seeking to gain, or it now exercises it, or it is struggling to preserve control of Middle East oil resources. This is how Noam Chomsky put it, right? Chomsky, Obama continues Bush policy to control Middle East oil. Now, it's no surprise that you rarely find analysts in this camp seeking to demonstrate how the United States actually exercises some kind of overarching power over oil price or supply, because the few that do have come up empty-handed. So Oilcraft starts with three simple axioms that, taken together, go far in falsifying all the overblown analyses, journalism, punditry, and history writing about oil and strategy. The first is that in a market filled with buyers and sellers, everyone has access. Consider the now hazily remembered days of the so-called energy crisis, right? And these kinds of illustrations appear in every textbook in US history, political science, and so forth. Okay. When the US began selling advanced arms, both to the Shah of Iran and the Saudi government, the latter among the so-called, and I'm putting it in quotes, boycotters, okay? And why did they do that? The story goes, in order to secure regional stability and preserve access. Let me say that we could spend an hour just on the things people have come to believe about the so-called oil crisis in 1973, most of it fiction. But it is when the Massachusetts Institute of Technology economist Maury Edelman tried to bring reason back into the discussion. In peacetime, markets guarantee buyers access without the need for force. Producers cannot target a specific country without shutting down production to all countries. And no state has ever opted to keep all its oil in the ground rather than sell it for the goods, services, prisons, palaces, weapons, and so forth that it buys. So I've actually traced these ideas back to the 1920s. But keep in mind, okay, that back then, oil had not yet come to be seen as exceptional. Quite the opposite, in fact. All raw materials and natural resources were seen as vital to Western existence, and access to them seemingly under constant threat. So back then, these beliefs animated radical critics of US intervention in Vietnam. I came of age, actually in the year of the oil crisis, I started college, and I learned revisionist diplomatic history for the first time when I read The New Left and learned that really the main goal of US foreign policy was to secure control of natural resources everywhere, that Vietnam was about the control of resources and so forth. Okay. The left said it was really all about control of these raw materials. The militant right, though, at the same time, worried that the Eisenhower and Kennedy administrations had failed to understand the threat posed by decolonization and the vital role, they said, the colonies played in supporting the needs of civilization, all the raw materials. Now, it is only, our book argues that it is only with the oil crisis of 73, a kind of psychological trauma in the US whose impact we're still feeling today. Here's a slide I just stole off of the internet by some professor in some professor's lectures. You notice it says OPEC oil embargo. OPEC never embargoed anyone, but people believe it deeply, right? Right? It's only with the oil crisis that oil takes on the magical status it has today. And all the histories of the earlier decades have gotten rewritten to reflect this, okay? Okay, second axiom. Another MIT professor, Barry Posen, the head of the Institute's Security Studies program and a consultant to the Defense Department, has followed in Edelman's footsteps. That is, Posen has called for a radical rethinking of what he calls America's unnecessary, counterproductive, costly, and wasteful global spanning strategic posture and military force structure in Europe, Asia, and in the Persian Gulf. He's one of the main ideologues, if you will, of restraint or offshore balancing in a furious debate these days as the Biden administration comes in. Now, Posen concluded in his book, what we don't need to be doing, right, is any effort now or in the future to preserve the current Saudi government in power. And I heard a lot of people shaking when they hear that one in particular. After all, after working through the set of routinely evoked claims that ostensibly justify the military presence, the presumed vulnerability of transit routes, the threat of a future Saddam Hussein-like figure who would raise prices or withhold supply, Posen concludes that the threats and benefits that are usually invoked are not compelling or cannot be dealt with efficiently by military power. Either they're made up or military power can't solve the problem, right? Now, I've been able to trace this kind of objection along the strategic side of things back to the end of World War II. Okay? Posen thinks, again, and that was for all raw materials that people were stressing about for decades. Posen thinks that since the result of a cost-benefit analysis is both straightforward and inescapable, there must be some other factor X, and it's very hard for me to come up with a slide for factor X that explains the enormity of the sums expended when the flow of oil itself has never been seriously at risk. And I quote him, "I suspect that global prestige and influence is this factor X." Now, that is close to what some of my comrades mean when they talk about US hegemony. It's also what John Holdren, President Obama's science advisor, said before there was a President Obama, which was that we're in the Gulf more to preserve our status as a superpower than to do anything materially about securing or guaranteeing the flow of oil. Now, Posen adds at the end of this analysis that even this argument is not self-evidently strong. That is, it's impossible to account for this capacity in any kind of tangible way. In terms of the discounted price that refiners pay, additional quantities shipped, or extra reserves that big oil claims on its books as a result of decades of force projection, or of all the non-existent attacks or attempts to take over the Persian Gulf that one thinks the US force is there to stop, okay? Now, beware those who claim that the issue is more complicated but don't specify how. If it is global prestige and influence that strategists and activists believe the US Navy delivers, well, to me, that reads just like another strategic rationale, to use an international relations phrase, akin to others about the government cares about civilizing missions in the past, or cares about democracy promotion today, or they're worried about falling dominoes, and the like. All these kinds of framings of problems that the left have constantly argued are not the true reasons, because the true reasons are the material control of these oil resources. Oil is different, or so many believe, but is the claim true? Sure, historians will continue to mine the archive for evidence that behind the rhetoric, oil was the real preoccupation of principles in some event or crises. My friend Irene Genzer's book saying that oil was really what Palestine was all about. Okay? But these folks never question the rationality of policymakers' beliefs, and not least their own, having already committed to this view of the centrality of oil, okay, about the thing itself. Finally, for many policymakers and analysts, the United States itself is a uniquely stabilizing force in the market for the world's most vital commodity. As the argument goes, absent US primacy, supply and therefore price would be that much more volatile. Posen encapsulates this view, of which he is quite skeptical, as follows. The guardianship of the US military since the 1980s has preserved order, guaranteed supply against political shock, and so has underwritten the price that all consumers pay. Although, right, he adds, I see no evidence of this benefit. That is because there isn't any evidence. To the contrary, all these accounts of oil's unique strategic value driving the politics of intervention, of a potent oil weapon that the Saudi leaders wield alone or as part of OPEC, wittingly or not, as the left likes to say, on behalf of the US hegemon, and of the gains from the United States' efforts on behalf of oil refiners and consumers. All of these founder, if we compare the volatility of oil prices with that of all other of the more humdrum commodities bought and sold on the world market. So the third axiom is that throughout the 20th century and now into the 21st century, the price of all raw materials rise and fall in tandem. Here's a graph from Roger Stern's still unpublished work that shows this quite clearly by comparing the price curves for all commodities, energy, and farm products. You notice those curves fit very closely together. Okay. right? And look at the time period. We're talking about, this is when the British were hegemons in the Persian Gulf. We're talking about, and Western oil giants were said to have controlled prices, which people believe wrongly because they use the wrong prices to test, okay? But we can talk about that. An idea, or let me put it this way, Edelman said, no, that never happened, okay? We're talking about the time of low US involvement, and since 1970s, the era of unrivaled American hegemony in the region. It turns out, in other words, that all the blood and treasure spent on the so-called prize hasn't mattered a bit, at least not in the ways that most experts and citizens, consumers and activists, and yes, even many presidents and generals, let alone professors, imagine. So oil, like race, doesn't exist, at least not as a thing over which states have fought numerous wars across the century, as many believe, for which a stable market cannot exist absent the deployment of the US Fifth Fleet, that in the hands of the enemy might be used to bring the advanced capitalist economies to their knees, and that therefore has to be secured, no, controlled, for the industrial world, or more narrowly, the US hegemons, or more narrowly still, big oil's benefit. And so the idea of access to oil, which animates so much of what the US does in the world, is no less culturally constituted than any other dimension of policy. It takes a great deal of work, in fact, to make control of oil, or access to oil, both tangible and commonsensical. Its materiality is a mirage. And to return to my analogy with racism, today we generally don't stress too much about what those who were responsible for the creation of the Jim Crow system or apartheid said or thought. Okay, we don't care much about what they believed about the inherent superiority of some and the inferiority of others. And some still believe these things. We give the ideas themselves at best cursory treatment unless you are an intellectual historian or are trying to figure out where these ideas came from or how these ideas were superseded. Instead, as I said, as the critique gains ground, we tend now to instead analyze these ideas in terms of their effects. And those effects are not always or often necessarily the ones that those who held the beliefs imagined or not to be true. So separation of the races in the views of those who held these beliefs secured the continued greatness of the dominant race by protecting genes from contamination or degradation, so they said. But now, instead, we don't talk about that. We talk about the impact segregation had on dividing the labor movement, on reducing wages and so forth. Old ideas about scarcity and conflict, rooted in 19th century social Darwinism, neo-mercantilism, geographical determinism, and scientific racism, all of which are impossible to disentangle from the imperialism of that era, I argue, have a long half-life. Okay, in their modern guises, they mobilize environmental activists and galvanize opposition to intervention. But they also win votes. Yes, war for oil, if otherwise it means higher gas prices. They justify arms sales, guarantee the weapons makers' bottom lines, and subsidize the cost that the Pentagon pays for its own purchases. They smooth the way for government transfer of public wealth into private hands. The world still pays for Gulf oil in dollars, and Saudi petrodollars continue to flow into US finance and real estate markets. There are other effects. It is just that the ideas themselves aren't true. So thanks for watching the show. All right. Now we're gonna stop share. We're back.
Right, we are back, Bob. Thank you for this very clear overview of the arguments. I think really one of the best achievements of the book is bringing oil back to a commodity as other commodities without these kind of magical powers that are often attached to it. And somewhere in the book, you're writing not only about the politics attached to these kind of positions, I'm paraphrasing you now, but giving up on these mythologies comes with a cost in terms of if you look to the critique that is giving to power projection of the US, etc. But it also opens up new pathways of new criticism, but also I would say of new research, of seeing oil as a commodity, among others, that we can kind of look at and go back to. Maybe starting there, because you start the book also with a kind of going longer back into history, into war period, tackling arguments that Japan was interested in kind of acquiring oil resources in the Second World War, that was one of the motives of, Japanese war machine, etc. But if you look to the first half of the 20th century, there was some important entanglement between the oil companies and the state. In terms of the British petroleum in Iran, or French and the British in Iraq, the Americans in Saudi Arabia, in Southeast Asia, the Dutch and the Americans and the British as well. So how can we make sense of this entanglement without kind of reducing into this all overarching conspiracy of the state and the oil business? Was that more something relevant to that time framework that actually changed with the rise of the multinationals in later periods?
Well, first of all, those entanglements, right? And I spend a lot of time talking about them, or what I spend a lot of time doing is talking about the first critics of those entanglements, right? Between BP, as we call it now, and the British state and so forth. Those entanglements, they come about because of the power of these beliefs, right? That somehow, right? Think about it. This is a world of private corporations that are securing these rights. And in that era, it was believed the state had to secure, the state had to back those champions, the argument went, right? Because somehow that guaranteed the security of supply, right? And the national security of the citizens or subjects of those places, right? So this was the understanding of it. And what the critics that I look at, there are a set of scholars at Columbia University who were amazing to me, sort of said, none of this makes sense. That, right, people just believe viscerally, like Americans do now, that somehow if we're in the Gulf, that somehow is making US citizens more secure. Or if the British, the examples they use, if it's a British firm controlling the rubber concession in Malaysia, or the French, controlling some concession elsewhere, that somehow security of subjects were enhanced. But what these analysts argue, this is driven by a lot of fear and suspicion, right? And worry that if they don't back their champions, they are somehow going to be cut out of the market. But what these critics have shown is, one, the identity of firms did nothing for the security of ordinary citizens in those places, right? So we've got two choices, and I can't resolve the question. The progressives in the 1920s, and this school of thought continues on until this day. Chomsky is in some sense the heir of it. The progressives assumed government leaders understood the same things that they did, in which case the arguments for championing concessions on the part of their private firms were really in service of the firms, that the benefits went to the firms, right? So that was that's one choice, that they were somehow acting as beneficiaries of the firms, because again, otherwise your thinking is irrational, as they proved over and over again, right? The alternative is to imagine, and you could imagine in the United States in particular, many liberals and conservatives have argued back then to today that it's crazy to think that it's the firms calling the shots, right? So then you have some problem of this like kind of autonomous, view on the part of the state as to what, as to who benefits. But those views are fundamentally wrong in some sense. But I can't resolve that debate. But I certainly have come to believe that I quoted John Hobson, back from 1902. He was really smart on this question. He sort of said, I think it's wrong to think that government officials are dissimulating or are aware of contradictions, right? So they might believe, that somehow America benefits from Aramco being in Saudi Arabia rather than the British, right? But the only bottom line is the only way that governments benefited, right? I also show in my book that British officials at key point test this claim. Yeah, what is the national security interest in now backing BP in Iran and Iraq? And they said there really is none. We don't get, after all, BP is selling oil on the world market. There's no, right? And then during times of conflict, there's no way to get that oil to Great Britain to begin with. So the strategic rationales are kind of refuted in a way. But what's undeniable is that Treasury benefited from the foreign exchange positions, right? And I think that's part of the story through today, whether or not officials are aware of the same. The US gets a lot of benefits from the fact that for its current account deficits, because it's, oil is denominated in dollars, right? For balance of payments purposes, it's great. But for security of supply, it's absolutely not necessary. Is that why they're doing this? I can't say, right?
No, I think that's absolutely true. But also to weave this element into my second question.
Mm-hmm.
The first half of the 20th century, we are talking about empires and kind of also geographical competition that is going on in there. So you have also taking aim at the more progressive critiques of this narrative. But as you actually state in the book, there are different narratives there on the left, particularly. One is absolutely very simplistic on, this is all about gaining direct control over oil resources. And you very rightly, I think, give the example of the Iraq War. If there is destruction of the oil resources, if there are sanctions, the oil supply is actually insecure rather than secure. But you also bring up the other element, but don't really tease it out, and that's more denying of access, if you want, and the competition with China, etc., that comes into play. Somewhere you do relate to transport issues, the sea routes, etc. Do you think there is something in that argument, or that is also a weak argument of, not in normal times, obviously, because the market forces are doing their works, but if the competition would come to a point of military conflicts or whatever, having the advantage of closing off sea routes for the oil transport, would that be part of the explanation, even if not the explanation?
This is a tricky one, right? I am not a military strategist, nor are you, nor are most people who write about, security of supply and military, right? Which is why I went to Barry Posen and asked him this. He is a specialist. And Posen's answer was the following. It's kind of crazy to believe that any rival power is about to or has in their sights the takeover of the Persian Gulf for their oil resources, right? And I wrote in the book about when was the first time we started putting forward this argument. You will remember yourself in 1979 and 1980, and this vision that the Soviets were going to come and take over oil supplies. And, these analysts of Soviet history sort of said that, it makes no sense for a number of reasons. But people ran with those beliefs. Sam Huntington, I discovered for the first time Francis Fukuyama. That's where he cut his teeth as an analyst and believing this stuff. And Dennis Ross. These were all specialists who were insisting the Soviets were going to come. They're going to take over this oil. And they had this like kind of strange vision or belief that if the Soviets took over that oil, that would somehow undermine the Western alliance, right? Europe and Japan would be taken away from the U.S. because they would need the oil resources themselves, or something like that. And of course, the left has the exact same mirror version of that story. They believe that's what's going on right now, that the US control of these resources in the Persian Gulf is what guarantees its hegemony against its capitalist rivals, not its enemies, but this is what keeps the alliance in line. And I tried to show why that really doesn't make sense to me. But for Barry Posen, a guy who thinks about, real war scenarios, he says there's no vision of a general war that anyone is planning at the present time. And were one to get into a conflict with China, his argument is you don't need to be in the Persian Gulf in order to deny them access to oil, if that's what you were trying to do. He said, we have enough military power to stop any tanker from moving, oil to China, if that's what it came to. So I don't, it sounds right using that metaphor that I use in the book that I stole from Douglas Feith, of all people. If you see the world like the old Risk game, right, where things are moving around, this kind of makes sense to you. But real military strategists, it doesn't make sense, right? So it makes sense for the amateurs, strategic amateurs, and others. So I can't say more than that. We can say this though, right? You remember that in 2003, 2004, when the United States went to war in Iraq, the sophisticated leftist argument, or the geostrategic version of it was, the world is running out of oil. How do we know this? Because the price is going up. We have to secure what's left. And there's going to be more and worse oil wars in the future, right? But it was all about the US and China at this point. Well, what did we discover, right? So versus that vision, which let's say Michael Clare holds dear and Bill McKibben endorsed and others endorsed at the time, what do we know about it? Well, all that oil that Chinese state-owned oil companies secured through contracts, like any other oil firm, okay, that oil doesn't flow to China. Right? It's not like this neo-mercantilist vision. Chinese firm in Africa must be going to China. Those firms themselves secure their operating costs, their operating capital on the world financial markets. In order to do that, they have to operate like other oil firms. What do they do in order to ensure their profits? They sell oil on the world market. And 90% of the Chinese oil that the state-owned oil companies controlled through contracts, they didn't control it, they gain access to it and sell it, sold those resources to customers around the world, not to China. The same with Indian firms, et cetera. So one of the things is, I think one of the real problems, and I say this over and over again in the book, if you think strategically, you don't have to ever bother to think about how a barrel of oil gets to market in a way, right? Or you don't have to think about those firms. You imagine them as either handmaidens of the state, right? That's the mercantilist vision of China. So some people today argue, yes, maybe the US is a liberal, political economy, but China definitely isn't. So these state-owned firms are their tools, right? Or you believe that the US firms are, calling the shots. So as I gave you many examples in the book, comrades of mine who argued the United States was in Iraq to get the oil resources for the Western oil firms, et cetera,
Sure.
right?
Yeah. Well, this brings me actually to the last question, because we don't have more time left. But because it's very difficult to disagree with this story. And as I said, if you read the book, it's really just a myth debunking after the other. And of course, that's the main aim of the book. So maybe this is not a fair question if I ask, because what do you think that explains the reason of the excessive presence of the US and involvement in the Middle East. Again, maybe this might be the next book project. But at the end of the book, you return to Barry Posen's Factor X. And I think throughout the book, you give some elements. There are parts of the book where you refer to prestige and status of the US in the region, even the element of racism, kind of the
for sure,
threat that comes from the Muslims, the Middle Easterns, the Arabs, etc. And the role, obviously, of petrodollars that is really being paid to all these think tanks, etc., who push these ideas. So are these the three elements, or is there more to it, or is this really something that we actually have to start rethinking?
Well, I think unfortunately there are many things going on, because some states, some government officials just believe these strategic ideas, right? Or and they can't be shaken from those beliefs. Others, one of the other arguments I lay out in the book is to show, okay, so what is the problem with those states that have transited, I use the language, right, from ally to enemy, right? Venezuela was an ally, but now is not. Saddam, right, was and now is not, right? Iran was and now is not. But we know that each of those states have deep interest in selling as much oil as they can on the world market, and they're being stopped from doing so, not right? I mean, they're not completely being stopped because smuggling happens all the time, et cetera. But the sanctions are there in some sense, as you said, disrupting world oil supply. Though, of course, the United States is never described as attacking the world economy, by laying down those sanctions. And I compare that with, you remember a year ago or so, Iran fired those missiles, right, at Saudi facilities, right? And how was that described? An unparalleled account on the stability of the world economy, right? But we do a lot more. The United States does a lot more for stopping oil supplies than Iran could ever do, et cetera, right? Which has led some people on the left to say, that's the real reason. What the United States is doing is, dealing with oversupply problems to solve the problem for oil companies. I don't believe that. But what it seems to me a common element in those three cases, Iran, Iraq, and Venezuela, is it's the rents that are the problem, right? These oil resources, right? The rents raised by oil resources in these particular states are being used to do what? Not support U.S. hegemony, if you want, or U.S. dominance, but to challenge it in all sorts of ways, right? So that's the real problem.
Those are being targeted.
Yeah, but those are being targeted, but it's certainly not about the oil per se, right? So, I think one other factor that's involved is that policy, and I say this in the book, politicians also, like, we're there to demonstrate that we're a superpower. If imagine the a worst case scenario. Let's imagine the Al Saud, or the Saudis are taken over, and it becomes the Islamic Emirate of Arabia. What's going to happen? Well, Brookings Institution is going to be, and your colleague Bernie Hagel is going to be upset, et cetera, right? But for politicians, they know this is going to happen. If it's a Democratic Party in office at that time, they're going to be hammered by the Republicans for losing this vital thing, et cetera, right? So I think it's and vice versa. So I think it's something like politicians can't, they know that nothing they're doing is really rational at the level of securing supply, even though they say that's what they're doing, but they can't afford to do anything different, right? Because of the possible political fallout from other parties. You just think about how hard it was for Obama to do anything to move the ship of state, a 2 or 3, degrees, right? He gets hammered for it. He's left the Middle East and so forth, right? So I think there's like this, not prejudice, but a short-term viewpoint on the part of politicians that would make it very difficult. But at the same time, there are all these crazy beliefs that are being reinforced that, somehow the world is more stable because the US was there. We saw Ken Pollock, Stephen Cook, and Hal Brands just argue that in foreign policy. The most successful policy for 30 years, the US was in the Gulf, everything was smooth and so forth, but without any evidence whatsoever, right? It's like a belief. But
No, I mean, we can't underestimate the power of ideas, and they get
mm-hmm.
to live of their own. So, and myths die hard, and
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
and definitely the myths about oil are so widespread and deep rooted. But I'm sure your book has made a start, and will start the waters. So we look forward to the debate, and hopefully more people will engage with the argument. So looking forward to that.
God
Thank you,
willing.
Bob, for this clear overview and discussion, making time to visit us.
It
Thank you.
was a privilege. Okay, thanks. It's great to see you again.
Thank
Take
you.
good care.